Book of Lamentations, and we're in towards the end of chapter 3, middle of chapter 3. I don't know that I've ever taught a class where I'd cover 2.5 chapters in one class, but we're about to do it. And not that, I just don't think I can talk much more about this lamentation. It is lamenting. It's horrid. And I don't mean that from a negative standpoint of arguing against why is it even in the canon. But I'm saying that from this perspective, we can make some very summation kinds of statements and understand what Jeremiah is saying. When you disobey God, what happens? Punishment comes. Consequence comes. And is the severity of God's punishment strong? Yes. And does God's punishment over wickedness have unfortunate consequences sometimes? Yes. And what we mean by that is sometimes what we call collateral damage. In other words, I had to deal with this, and because I dealt with this, it had others who were affected by that. And when you read through these last couple of chapters of the Book of Lamentations, who does it seem was hurt the most by the actions of the older? The young, the children. And when you read some of these verses, again, that's why I just don't want to, I don't want to be miserable the whole night dealing too in depth with the kinds of things. You can read it and get the picture of what's being drawn here. But when I sin against God, the consequence comes, and though no one other than me is ever held accountable for my sins, there has never been an indication within Scripture that says my sins never have an effect or create a problem for other people. They aren't held accountable. Every child that is lost in this calamity and destruction and devastation that Babylon brings, I have every confidence is in the arms of God as we speak. But that doesn't mean in that moment that they weren't caught up in the physical calamity and challenges that that nation was facing. And it is sad. But I want you to also remember, were the children prior to God bringing judgment through Babylon, were they already suffering? Yes. Yes. In multiple ways. They were suffering because what weren't they being taught? God's law. I'll try to state this in the right kind of way. But one of the greatest harms that we could cause towards children is to forget to tell them about their Creator. One of the greatest acts of harms that we can cause. And there are lots of harms that also need to be avoided and are dangerous and hurtful towards children. Don't miss. I'm not trying to classify them. I'm just trying to state that one of them is the fact that children don't learn about their Creator. They were already harming their children. Long before Babylon ever arrived, long before the destruction of Jerusalem ever occurred, long before Nebuchadnezzar begins to besiege the city, long before any of those things occurred, they were already causing consequence to their children. Number one, by removing God from their knowledge. But what else were they doing? They had become part of the idolatrous abuse towards their own children had become part of their idolatrous worship. And so before we, as maybe my mind even at a moment or two when I read through these things went to, how could God, and in some ways that's kind of what Jeremiah is saying in some senses, how could God why did He need to bring such devastation that apparently these children get washed up in that challenge as well. And my mindset goes back to the fact that the children were already in danger by the acts of the leaders and parents that were there in Judah. And so they were already being in danger. And in some ways, this might have been an act of challenge that God needed to bring ultimately to save a future generation. If they were allowed to continue in the path, how much longer would this idolatry continued. How many more children would have been sacrificed to the gods and the idols of the people? How many more innocents would have been lost if God had not finally said, enough, and He brings His judgment and He cleanses Judah, and then He's going to restart after the captivity anew with them.
You're
Go ahead,
right.
Robert.
That's all these children knew was worshiping idols. And if they're allowed to survive this, that's all they know to take forward to the rest of their families.
Right. That will never stop. Something had to stop the progression of that. And it's unfortunate, and it's a sad reality that the older generation was refusing the knowledge that Jeremiah and others were bringing. And there's no questioning the fact that some knowledge of God was still in existence among the people, because while all this is happening down here in Jerusalem and in Judah, what's going on back in Babylon with at least 4 fellows we know of? Yeah, there's still some faithful ones, right? There's still men like Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego back there in Babylon in captivity, who are honoring their God and serving their God, so that the knowledge of God had not completely left the people. But from a general standpoint, the nation had left Jehovah. And the consequences were severe and extremely sad to consider and think about all the difficulties that they had to encounter because of the conduct of others. Any thoughts or questions up there? That's a bit of a ramble for a minute, but we'll come back to the text. Let's go to chapter 3 then. And again, we're going to probably move very swiftly. I have a plan to finish Lamentations tonight. We'll talk to you a little bit about how we've talked some in this class about transliteration. We've talked a little bit about the challenge of figuring out, here's this small leaf of a biblical document. How did they determine that this piece fit at this point in Jeremiah's prophecies? And so Sunday, I plan to do a little bit of that with you. We could probably spend more time than one class period, but on Sunday, what I plan to do is talk to you a little bit about how did our Bible come to be? How do we have these copies in English for us? I thought that might be a good one moment study to kind of finish this series, and then the following Sunday we'll start something completely different and new. And remember, next Wednesday is singing night in this process. So announcements over. Back to Lamentations chapter 3. Notice verse 40. Let us search and try our ways, and turn again to Jehovah. Let us lift up our heart with our hands unto God in the heavens. We have transgressed and have rebelled. Thou hast not pardoned. Thou hast covered with anger and pursued us. Thou hast slain and thou hast not pitied. Thou hast covered thyself with the clouds so that no prayer can pass through. He's expressed that sentiment before, but here's this Jeremiah says, God's judgment came, and what should they have done? Yeah. Repentance should have already occurred. We should already, and that's kind of the sentiment here to me, is we should already be back in relationship with God. We should have repented and turned from these things a long time ago. These things should have been resolved already, but we refused, and because we refused to repent, there's no pardon coming. And we talked a little bit, I believe, Sunday morning about the idea of a pardon comes to whom? Somebody that doesn't, that's guilty, but it comes, yeah, right. But it doesn't necessarily come by any warrant of their own, right? It doesn't come because they did something. They were absolutely guilty. We're absolutely guilty of sin, but God pardons it, even though we're guilty. But He says the pardon's not coming. His anger is upon us. He will pursue us, and there won't be any pitying going on in the midst of all of those things. Notice verse 46. All our enemies have opened their mouth wide against us. Fear and the pit are come upon us, devastation and destruction. My eye runneth down with streams of water for the destruction of the daughter my people. Generally, they speak sometimes within the Hebrew language of the daughter as Jerusalem, or Zion is often referred to as the daughter. And so when he sees the absolute devastation and destruction that has come upon the daughter, Jerusalem in particular, he does what? He cries. You know, there's not, when pardon's not coming, pity's not coming, answer's not coming, no nation's going to come and save us. God's not interested in saving us. In fact, He's bringing the condemnation. There's nothing. They've got nothing but to just weep tears of sorrow over the condition that they had created by their decisions and choices that they had made. Mine eye poureth down and ceaseth not without any intermission. I'm sure we've all hit some low spots, and so you can imagine. Here Jeremiah has hit such a low that it just, he says his sorrow doesn't even have an intermission to it. It's just continual. Till Jehovah look down and behold from heaven, mine eye affecteth my soul because of all the daughters of my city. They have chased me sore like a bird, they that are mine enemies without cause. They have cut off my life in the dungeon, have cast a stone upon me. Waters flowed over my head. I said, I am cut off. I called upon thy name, O Jehovah, out of the lowest dungeon. Thou heardest my voice. Hide not thine ear at my breathing, at my cry. Their disdain for him had come on multiple occasions. In the prophecy, in his prophecy, he talked, remember, about the times where he'd been in prison, and the difficulties that he had had. If you recall, at one time, Zedekiah and he kind of have a private conversation in the midst of that challenge, and Zedekiah kind of gives him a little bit of favor and says, as long as there's bread in the city, make sure Jeremiah gets a piece of bread every day. But ultimately, all the bread's gone, and the people are blaming Jeremiah for everything that's going on. He's lamenting over what he sees happening in Jerusalem. It's just sad. The challenges that he sees. But where is he still looking for his refuge from? Even though he knows the nation's not going to be pardoned, even though he knows that God is bringing this destruction and you're not turning him from it, even though he understands all the facts, he's still looking to the one source that he can find help from. Thou hast pleaded the causes of my soul. Thou hast redeemed my life. O Jehovah, thou hast seen my wrong. Judge thou my cause. Thou hast seen all their vengeance and all their devices against me. Thou hast heard their reproach, O Jehovah, and all their devices against me. The lips of those that arose up against me and their devices against me all the day. Behold, thou their sitting down and their rising up. I am their song. He had become such a mockery to them that you could almost imagine their equivalent of the comedic folks that we have around today that sit around and do nothing but write up mocking skits and thoughts and songs about it. Well, he had become that to the nation. And so he's hit the bottom because of everything. He's hit the bottom because no one would listen when he told him all this was coming. He's hit the bottom because he's witnessed all the destruction that's going on around him. He's hit the bottom because they blame him and they've become his enemies because of it. It's just, he's hit a tremendously low point. And he reminds the Lord, though, thou wilt pursue them in anger and destroy them from under the heavens of Jehovah. And Jeremiah calls for justice across the board in relationship to all the things that he has witnessed, both personally and through the nation. Any thoughts about chapter 3 before I move on?
I'm trying to figure out, I guess, the parallel between this time and the wars and things going on and now. Because we can sit down and read this minus the struggle that we find in trying to figure out who's talking and who's not talking and all that kind of stuff. But there's still the lesson there, how things go from the older to the younger, the change in the nations over maybe periods of hundreds of years. The fact, then we see the nation today, and I know I keep mentioning these kind of things, we're in a tough time. We need to keep mentioning it. Here we had Jeremiah, he's the only one that's paying any attention to it. Everything else is falling apart around him, and he's the only one that's crying.
Right. Over what's happening.
So to me, the lesson in all this stuff is, although I know it's repetitive and I get bored as anybody else trying to figure it out, there's a big lesson here for us in that we don't let this happen. And if we look around, even in my lifetime, things are not anywhere near the same. Evil is everywhere. Things are going on and accepted that nobody has ever accepted. So what's the next generation? Here, we're the old people. And we're leaving all of this trash for the younger people to figure out, and they just throw up their hands and don't even, they've been around it so long they don't pay any attention to it. It doesn't alarm them.
Right.
You know, talk to some young people.
Yeah. And I think you're right. And there's this hard balance sometimes with all these things, because we're not the parallel. America's not the parallel to Judah in the sense that we don't hold any particular relationship. In fact, but maybe that should scare us more, because they were the people of God, he probably held, well, I don't know, I'll take the word probably, I think I can say with assurance that he was more patient and more long-suffering and more tolerable in a sense, because he was using them to eventually fulfill a purpose. That's not the case with us in the same fashion. And so we don't have the ability to make the appeal as a nation like they did. And so the consequences that come because of our actions can come much differently than it did even for them. And maybe even in a more challenging way and destructive way. And if we, any time, the Bible's filled with, in some ways, one-line phrases that remind us, woe unto them that call good evil and evil good. Woe unto the nation who that doesn't recognize that righteousness exalts it and sin is a reproach. I mean, they go on of texts that remind us that sin will destroy. And the scary part about it, Jack, which is what you're saying, is that it's one thing to have sin exist among people. It is another thing for more and more sinful practices to be accepted by people. And that's the scary place maybe that we're arriving at, is the acceptance level.
That's why, what you mentioned a while ago, people sitting around writing up little funny skits and things like that. Because to people it's funny. Sin's funny. It's not something to get alarmed about. It's, the worse you can make it and be funny, sin sells.
Yeah. Well, and at times humor is a diffuser.
Yeah.
It can make things seem much more palatable than they should be. And that again is kind of a dangerous place, is when things get joked about rather than recognized as for what they are. That can desensitize folks to the realities. People don't like to hear it, but the truth is, our nation was founded on the principles of freedom to choose whatever religious path we want to take. But it was also designed and founded upon moral principles of Scripture. Not perfectly, and there were some flaws that have been rightly corrected over the decades. But to reject the concept that the Bible was never in the mindset of those who began our nation is useless. There's too much evidence to the contrary. Did you have a thought, Roger? I saw your hand a little bit ago. You good? All right. Go ahead, Bob.
The language of the writer here in Lamentations speaks of a cloud that wouldn't permit prayers to get to God. It speaks of they would be in darkness, not in light, and compared it to the grave of the forefathers, basically they're being separated from God. And I kind of have a little bit of a conflict between that and Daniel when they're praying to God, to the east, to Jerusalem, and praying. And it shows God or Christ walking in the oven there with those being punished, supposedly being punished. Do you see any conflict there between the two chapters?
No, and the reason I don't, and I thought about these things, I don't jump to an answer that quick normally, but I've thought through some of these things already. And the reason is Jack mentioned it earlier about sometimes it's hard to figure out who are we talking about and when. What person are we talking about and when? And one of the things Jack mentioned is the fact that you've got this situation where you're trying to figure out whose voice are who's speaking at a particular time and who's he talking about. And the cloud, to me, is a cloud over the nation. The nation can't appeal to God to change this thing. The nation can't appeal to God for pity. The nation can't ask for God to turn away from this destruction. That there's a cloud blocking their ability as a nation to have any effect upon God and the destruction that He's bringing. The individual Jeremiah still talked to him. Jeremiah just prayed at the end of Lamentations 3 about what he thinks he wanted God to do. And so he hasn't he hasn't turned his ears completely away from the individual who's willing to be penitent and faithful and honor his God. But he has created a cloud between the nation and himself where he's not going to react and respond to any request they make. That's what I saw.
You mentioned some of those circumstances a while ago, the individual part of it, with Daniel and the others.
Yeah. So you see moments where individuals have the ability to still have access. Any other thoughts, questions?
Just remembering ourselves to stay faithful, no matter how better things look.
Yeah, because the nation may lose its relationship with God, but I want to keep mine. And so I want to stay faithful no matter what's going on around me.
God's very merciful and faithful to us. So just remain faithful.
So notice his language here in chapter 4. How has the gold become dim? How is the most pure gold changed? The stones of the sanctuary poured out at the head of every street, the precious sons of Zion, comparable to fine gold. How are they esteemed? As earthen pitchers, the work of the hands of the potter. If you recall that we talked about at the beginning of Lamentations chapter 1, that many Hebrew folks look at this chapter or this book and call it how, the Hebrew word for how. Chapter 1 starts with how, chapter 2 starts with how, chapter 4 starts with how. How could these things happen? How could something so wonderful, so beautiful, so pure, the gold of the, how something so precious, how could it end up in the circumstance that it's in now? Those that were once esteemed, the princes, the rulers, the nobles, how could they go from state or condition to being honored and given privilege to the destruction and challenge that they're facing? Verse 3, he says, even the jackals. You got King James in your hand, you're probably seeing the phrase sea monster. I don't have any real reason why that got interpreted or moved into English as sea monster. I couldn't find any writings as to why. Some translations, very few, but some did that. Jackals, a more accurate description of the original word here in this text. And that's why I got the American Standard on the screen. But even the jackals draw out the breast. They give suck to their young ones. The daughter of my people has become cruel, like the ostriches in the wilderness. Does that mean anything to anybody? Somebody's become as cruel as an ostrich?
They forget they're young.
Okay.
Walk right over, step
Yeah.
on.
They will lay their eggs and leave and don't care. What they don't protect them necessarily. They'll bury them in the sand and as I understand it from what I'm reading, and they don't worry about whether predators or anything else. They are known for not protecting their young in the same sense that most other species will. And so he uses that to illustrate. They're like the ostriches out in the wilderness. How could you do that? Even the jackal. Okay, that's not necessarily the most friendly creature on earth, but he'll take care of his young. But you're like the ostrich who doesn't even care about your children. The tongue of the suckling child cleaveth to the roof of his mouth for thirst. The young children ask bread, and no man breaketh it unto them. They that did feed delicately are desolate in the streets. They that were brought up in scarlet embrace dungeons. I mean, if they happen to have a little bit of bread, the most vulnerable are just left with whatever. Why? If the child's not strong enough to take my slice of bread out of my hand, then he'll have to starve because I'm holding with mine. That's the condition they've gotten into. And be careful what we think here, because I'd love to believe that we would be compassionate and caring and would rather aid and help somebody else and die myself. But I don't know how any of us would react under these circumstances, where they're all starving to death. There's no sustenance, no way. It's all survival, and they've let the young go in the midst of all the survival. The iniquity of the daughter of my people was greater than the sin of Sodom, that was overthrown as in a moment, and no hands were laid upon it. He said the things that were going on among my people were worse than what was going on at Sodom. And we know what happened with Sodom. We know the destruction that God brought because of the sins of that place. And he said, I overthrew it, and know what?
No hands.
No hands were laid upon it. In other words, it didn't even take physical battle. It just fire and brimstone from God himself. It didn't even take a nation, warriors. It didn't take a fight to go in and overthrow it. Her nobles were purer than snow. They were whiter than milk. They were more ruddy in body than rubies. Their polishing was as of sapphire. Their visage is blacker than a coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It is become like a stick. They had gotten so deteriorated physically. Their nobles did. Their princes, their rulers. Generally speaking, if you saw a ruler walk down the street, would you know it was a ruler?
Oh, yeah.
Anybody turn on your television today? Any mistake in that scene? Right? Right? There was no mistaking that scene, right? My point is simply this. These folks would normally be recognized. They got led down the street. They were carried down the street. An entourage would follow them down the street. But things had gotten so bad, when you looked at folks along the streets of Jerusalem, you wouldn't know who was a prince and a noble from the poorest man in the nation. That's how deteriorated they had become. They're blacker than coal, dirty. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It lost so much weight from the utter starvation that their skins, as we say, it's just what? Just hanging on them, right? We say their skins just hanging on them. They that are slain with the sword, look at this, verse 9. They that are slain with the sword are better than they that are slain from hunger. For these pine away, stricken through, for want of the fruits of the field. Basically said you've been better off than to have lost life on the battlefield. These folks that are hanging on are losing life through the lack of food. The hands of pitiful women have boiled their own children. They were their food in the destruction of the daughter. My Jehovah hath accomplished his wrath, and poured out his fierce anger, and he hath kindled a fire in Zion, which hath devoured the foundations thereof. Let me stop for half a second, because I told you I wasn't lingering on any of these chapters. But I want you to think about this fact as well. We think, well, how devastating this must have been, and how horrible this is going on here among the people. And again, our minds may want to drift for a moment. How could God allow for these kinds of things to happen? But may I suggest to you this thought to consider. The people's reaction to the destruction and the devastation that was being brought was fostered by the kind of people they had become. They had already become brutish. They had already become evil. They had already and so when the calamity arrived, they simply responded by the very nature of behavior they had created among themselves. And so it wasn't unusual for them to just, if I could survive better than you, so sorry, I'm going to live. If it means destroying my own children, so be it. That was the mindset that they had created for themselves. So they're just reacting by the very behavioral decisions they had already made. And so don't just run to the idea of how could God, how could these people, how could they allow for their evil? And they still have opportunity to say, you know what, we chose this path. Our children didn't. But they're not thinking that way at all. Go ahead, Ed.
Didn't they sacrifice some of their children to idols?
Yeah, they had already, that's what I mean. They had already set the stage for this kind of behavior long before the judgment of God ever came. And so this isn't just about, well, why does God allow for these things to happen? This is about how do these people become so alienated from what was moral and right that when challenge comes, because I would sure hope that if devastation came to this town, that if devastation and challenge came to our nation, that the last thing on our minds would be to take advantage of the vulnerable. I would hope that personally, that we wouldn't be the kind of people that would the first instinct would be let's take advantage of the weak. But that's what they did as soon as the challenge came.
The difference between what's happened here and what happened to Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah had to be destroyed immediately so that Lot could escape. If they had been completely destroyed, then he might not have been allowed to escape. So, and then that's a difference between now. What you had just said was how the things that they had gotten involved in were so horrible that God is allowing them to learn the lesson the hard way. And verse 9 and 10 is the two key verses right there to draw the comparison. Better to die quickly than have to die through hunger.
Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, just like you're saying, the whole subject matter is God's punishment. And to receive God's punishment, you had to do something wrong. It's just like when I was a kid. I did something wrong, I knew I was going to get punished. Whether it was right then or down the road a little bit, I was going to get it. And down the road was always worse than getting it right then.
Yeah. But here's the difference, Bob, you would hope. The hope would be that in the midst of the discipline, I would also be being educated about that I made this choice and this is my response. I did this. To add insult to the problem here, what's happening among them is they're being punished for what they did, and it's like me getting a licking when I'm a kid, and I say to my dad, well, go whip the other 4 too because I got one. And that's kind of what's happening with the people. They're saying, I'm going to take advantage of all the vulnerable, and I'm going to punish these weaker ones because I'm getting punished, rather than learning something from it.
Well, those that was destroyed in Sodom, they didn't learn a lesson. They was killed. Those killed with a sword here didn't learn a lesson. But those who lived was taught a lesson.
And again, he says it's because of the sins. Verse 13, of her prophets and the iniquities of her priests that have shed the blood of the just in the midst of her. They wander as blind men in the streets. They are polluted with blood, so that men cannot touch their garments. Depart ye, they cried unto them, unclean. Depart, depart, and touch not. When they fled away and wandered, men said among the nations, they shall no more sojourn here. The anger of Jehovah hath scattered them. He will no more regard them. They respected not the persons of the priests. They favored not the elders. Our eyes do yet fail in looking for our vain help. In our watching we have watched for a nation that could not be saved. It gets sadder every verse. The sad condition of the people. They disrespected the legitimate prophets. They disrespected their elders. The disrespect was continual among them. And because of that, greater calamities began to fall upon them. Notice verse 19. Our pursuers were swifter than the eagles of the heavens. They chased us upon the mountains. They laid wait for us in the wilderness. The breath of our nostrils, the anointed of Jehovah, was taken in their pits, of whom we said, under his shadow we shall live among the nations. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, thou dwellest in the land of Uz. The cup shall pass through unto thee also. Thou shalt be drunken, and shalt make thyself naked. The punishment of thine iniquity is accomplished. O daughter of Zion, he will no more carry thee away into captivity. He will visit thine iniquity. O daughter of Edom, he will uncover thy sins. And that parallels some of the things that we read at the end of Jeremiah. If you remember, he begins to pronounce all of those judgments against multiple nations at the end of the book of Jeremiah. And at the end of this portion of his lament, he does the same thing. He talks about the destruction that's coming to others. And so don't sit back and think, well, we're getting away with what we're doing for a while. Judgment's coming. And justice of God is coming across the board. Jump to chapter 5. So after all these things, after he labels tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, sadness after sadness, the dark condition of the people, he says as he begins to conclude, remember, O Jehovah, what has come upon us. Behold and see our reproach. Our inheritance is turned unto strangers, our houses unto aliens. Stop for a second. What's interesting about the fact that their houses are being turned over to somebody else? That's how they got them. If you recall, go back into the book of Deuteronomy, what was Moses' warning to them when they were about?
Don't become complacent because you didn't build it.
Yeah, he told them when they went into the land, he says, I'm going to give you houses you didn't build, wells you didn't dig, cities that you didn't build the walls of. When he gave them the promised land, he warned them. You stay with me because I'm giving this to you, and if I've given it to you, I can what? I can take it back. I can take it back. Guess what? He just took it back. He just took it back and gave it to somebody else. They had been warned long, long ago that they needed to behave and to honor their God and respect their God if they wanted the benefits that he would continue to bring to them. But the moment they decided to vacate, he took all that he had blessed them with over the generations and just gave it to somebody else. We're orphans and fatherless. Our mothers are as widows. We have drunken our water for money. Our wood is sold unto us. Can you imagine, I'm trying to give you a figure of this, but could you imagine somebody standing in your kitchen, and as you fill your cup of water, they charge you for it? It's your kitchen, it's your water, it's your glass, but they're standing there with their hand out, and that's what's happened. Babylon has come in. They own the land now. They control all the resources. They control all the aspects of it. And so you're paying for the very water that once belonged to you. But Babylon wants its tribute in order to drink your own water. Wood that you once owned, that you could cut down and use for whatever purpose you had in mind, not anymore. You're paying Babylon for that. You don't own it anymore. Our pursuers are upon our necks. We're weary. I imagine you would be. Think about that. I mean, how long could you carry somebody? If I strap somebody to your back tonight, how long could you carry? They're weary because the Babylonians have been strapped. The Assyrians have been strapped. All these other nations have been strapped on them, and they're having to carry them along. We've given the hand of the Egyptians to the Assyrians to be satisfied with bread. Our fathers sinned and are not, and we have borne their iniquities. We've tried everything we could. For food for the belly, we've sold our land, we've sold our possessions, we've sold our children. We have vacated anything and everything that should have been precious to us. If the to whoever would buy it, if the Egyptians would buy it, the Assyrians would buy it, whoever. And it's kind of hard to sell a piece of ground, is it not? You don't generally get top dollar when Babylon's knocking on the door. Kind of hard to convince an Egyptian to come up and buy your property when he knows that maybe a month after or a year after he buys it, the Babylonians are going to come in and kick him out too. And so for slices of bread, they're getting rid of that which should have been precious to them. Our fathers sinned and are not. We have borne their iniquities. Not accountable for their actions, but we've borne we've borne the result of their sinful conduct. And the heaviness of the challenges we're dealing with is because of their choices that they made, especially in relationship to the nations. For the nation's servants rule over us. There is none to deliver us out of their hand. We get our bread out of the peril of our lives because of the sword of the wilderness. They have to risk their life for basic needs. It's sad. Our skin is black like an oven because of the burning heat of famine. They ravished the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Princes were hanged up by their hands. The faces of the elders were not honored. The young men bare the mill, and the children stumbled under the work. The elders have ceased from the gate, the young men from their music. The joy of our heart has ceased. Our dance is turned in mourning. It's just beyond understanding in some ways what's happening among them. There's not an ounce of joy to be found anywhere. The older men don't even want to, and how bad does it have to get when the older men don't want to sit down and talk, about the old days or better times or something. It's gotten so bad they don't even want to talk about it. They don't even gather at the gates anymore. The young men don't play any songs anymore. There's no joy. There's nothing. The joy of their hearts ceased. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe unto us, for we have sinned. Because of our choices, because of our sinful decisions, this is the result. For this is our heart is faint, for these things our eyes are dim. For the mountain of Zion, which is desolate, the foxes walk upon it. Thou, O Jehovah, abidest forever. Thy throne is from generation to generation. The people are being destroyed, temples being destroyed, Jerusalem's being destroyed. But who isn't being destroyed? God. Okay? You can destroy all the things. You can hurt and harm the people. Judgment can come against all those things. It can be such a sad, deplorable condition that the foxes are just roaming around where people once lived and thrived. But Jehovah still abides. Wherefore dost thou forget us forever and forsake us so long time? Turn thou us unto thee, O Jehovah, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old. But thou hast utterly rejected us. Thou art very wroth against us. We have really angered Jehovah. That's his ultimate conclusion. For these kinds of things to have occurred, for the nations who have fallen this hard, for these kinds of sins and treacheries to be implemented within the nation, we have really angered Jehovah. We should be turning back to him. If this won't wake the nation up about what they need to do in relationship to God, there's nothing going to wake them up. Go ahead, Ron.
A while ago, I didn't answer anything, was you and Jack been what I was going to bring up. But right now, when you're doing what, verse 11 or 12, 11 and 12, that is going on in the Middle East right now. And it's just headed wherever they can accomplish. Will it ever happen again in our lifetime? We better be prepared, let's just put it that way.
Right. Things left unguarded and unchecked can find its way into reality. And so we, in our last couple of minutes here, but we deal with a very interesting dynamic, because you've got our own. On one side of the coin, you've got this situation in our society where we are becoming more and more complacent with sin. We are becoming more and more accepting of things that God has qualified as abomination and sins against Him. And so we're told and bombarded continually that we should be more tolerant of those sinful practices. But the irony in all this is that practices of the oppressors are being thrown in the same mix. You have extremists who we're supposed to tolerate them too, and that so we've got this weird. On one side they're saying you're not tolerant enough of liberal-minded folks who want to do whatever they want to do with their bodies and their lives. And then they're also told, though, that we need to tolerate the folks that want to bring Sharia law into the mix. And so, how does that work? How do you have the same pocket of people who are on one side saying we need to be tolerant of things that would not be accepted among those other places in the world? Yeah, it's a weird kind of sense that folks have about things. It's hard to put your finger on. In one side, let's tolerate all these sinful practices. On the other side, we also need to tolerate allowing for and promoting of religious philosophy that is anti all of those things that we're also supposed to tolerate. It just doesn't make much sense to me.
When the Babylonians destroyed the temple and carried everything away, they never did get the Ark of the Covenant back, did they?
There's no record. So, yeah, we don't know.
I mean, they built the temple and had the altars, but they never had the Ark.
Yeah, no biblical record. Yeah.
There's no record anywhere, I believe, in writing of the Ark of the Covenant from the time of Solomon, where it was at or anything.
I'd have to go back and look. There is, you may be right, Lonnie. I'd have to go back. And try to recall the last reference to the ark in a biblical perspective. But I'm going to hold off on answering that because I want to be sure I'm right. I want to go back and look at it and make sure you give me the right answer to that. So I'll come back. Remind me that. I'll try to look at that between now and Sunday. So Sunday morning, we're done with Jeremiah and Lamentations. Sunday morning, we've got one more class in a quarter. So Sunday morning, we're going to just spend, the 35, 40 minutes talking about how do we get the Bible? How did we come to have this English copy of these old ancient documents? How can I have a copy of that in my hands? And again, we can't cover all the details of that in 40 minutes, but I'm going to give you just a brief history about that, Lord willing, on Sunday. Then next Wednesday, singing night, and then we'll start a new study altogether the following Sunday.